Imagine a world where the simplest act of kindness could change someone's life forever. A young black teen, riding the bus on an ordinary day, decides to do something most would consider common decency, giving up his seat for a pregnant woman. But little did he know that this small gesture would not only touch the heart of a stranger, but also turn the tables on a situation filled with humiliation, prejudice, and a twist of fate that no one could have predicted. As the bus rattles along, a confrontation breaks out. A white police officer, who's been eyeing the young man with suspicion from the moment he stepped onto the bus, sees an opportunity to assert power. The officer, already on edge, approaches the black teenager with a harsh tone, questioning his every move, dismissing his kindness as a threat. The teen, his heart pounding, tries to remain calm in the face of what feels like a personal attack. He's no stranger to discrimination, but today it's different. Today, the stakes are higher, and the weight of history feels heavy in the air. As the tension builds, the pregnant woman, standing nearby, watches in disbelief. The officer's harsh words seem to echo around the bus as people start to notice the exchange. It's a classic scene, a clear-cut example of racial profiling that's all too familiar. But just when the situation seems like it's about to spiral out of control, the officer's gaze shifts, and something catches his eye. He freezes, his expression changing in an instant. In that moment, the pregnant woman, visibly shaken by the scene unfolding before her, does something unexpected. She approaches the teen, her hand trembling as she hands him a folded note. With a soft voice, she whispers, "You don't know how much this will mean to you." Confused and unsure of what's happening, the teen looks down at the note, only to find a message that could change everything. The officer, still processing what just happened, takes a step back, his face hardening as the world around him seems to freeze. There's something about the note, and the woman's gesture, that's leaving him desperate for answers. His mind races, his heart pounds in his chest. What's so important about this note? Why did she give it to him? And more importantly, why does he suddenly feel like everything he's known about this moment is about to be turned upside down? As the bus comes to a halt, the officer's frustration reaches a boiling point. But it's not just the young man he's fixated on anymore. Something has shifted. The power dynamic has changed. And it's all because of a simple act of kindness, the kind of kindness that challenges prejudices, makes us question our beliefs, and forces us to look deeper into the lives of those around us. What happens next is something none of them could have ever imagined. The story doesn't end with the confrontation. It begins there. And as the teen unfolds the note in his hands, the officer's desperate gaze reveals a truth that none of them are ready for. Stay tuned to find out how one life-changing moment could unravel the secrets hidden beneath the surface, forever altering the course of their lives. As the bus pulled away, the atmosphere inside seemed thicker than before. The sounds of the engine whirring and the chatter of passengers faded into the background, swallowed by an awkward tension that hung in the air. The young teen, still holding the crumpled note in his hand, felt his heart racing as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. The woman, a stranger just moments ago, had handed him something with a sense of urgency. It wasn't just a kind gesture. It was something more, something deeper, a spark that felt like it might light a fire he wasn't prepared to handle. His name was Marcus, but he'd grown used to people not remembering it. It wasn't because he didn't matter. It was because, in the eyes of many, he wasn't supposed to. The world around him seemed to be built on invisible walls. Walls that kept people like him in place, in boxes marked less than and not enough. Growing up in a neighborhood where the odds were stacked against him, Marcus had learned to keep his head down and his expectations low. His mother always told him, "No matter what they throw at you, never forget who you are." But that was easier said than done when you felt like the world was trying to strip you of your identity at every turn. Marcus had never been one to start trouble. He kept to himself, stayed out of the way, and did his best to get through the days without drawing attention. But there was one thing he couldn't ignore: the way people looked at him. The way their eyes lingered longer than necessary, as if they were trying to see through him, to find out what kind of person he was before he even had the chance to speak. It wasn't just strangers who did it. It was the police, the store owners, even his classmates. And now, here he was, on a bus with a uniformed officer who had decided Marcus was a problem. The officer had started the confrontation with a snap of his voice, something barely audible to the other passengers, but loud enough for Marcus to hear clearly. "Why don't you take a seat in the back where you belong?" The words had stung, but Marcus had done his best to ignore them. He wasn't going to give this man the satisfaction of seeing him react. He knew how to handle people like that. But what he hadn't expected was the woman, the pregnant woman who had been standing by the door, struggling with her own balance, would step in. She wasn't just an observer. She was an active part of the scene, a catalyst for what was coming next. When Marcus had given her a seat, he had done it without thinking. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was simply the right thing to do. He had been taught that much by his mother. Kindness costs nothing. But in that moment, when the officer started to raise his voice even louder, the woman saw something in him, something more than just the typical young black teen who had likely been written off long ago. The officer's harsh words hadn't gone unnoticed. The passengers had started to murmur among themselves, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. No one had said a word, but the looks they exchanged were loud enough. Marcus knew they were all waiting for someone to make a move, someone to take charge of the situation, to restore order to the discomfort that had been growing. But the last thing he wanted to do was escalate things. He wasn't looking for trouble. He just wanted to get home without feeling like a criminal for breathing. The officer, however, had his mind set on something else. He had been watching Marcus closely, scanning him like he was a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit into his world. As Marcus tried to remain calm, his eyes occasionally flicked toward the note the woman had handed him. He hadn't even opened it yet, but it weighed heavily in his hand, its presence somehow more important than anything else going on around him. What did she want him to know? Why had she given him that note, right in front of the officer, who was now looking at him with a mixture of frustration and confusion? The moment stretched longer than it should have. The officer was still staring at Marcus, his hand twitching as if he was unsure whether to continue his interrogation or back off. The pregnant woman had quietly sat down, casting a final glance at Marcus before she settled into the seat. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The note had already done its job. As the bus continued its route, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. Something that would affect not just him, but the officer, the woman, and even the passengers who were all bearing witness to this tense encounter. He had never been the kind of person who believed in fate or destiny, but the strange series of events that had unfolded in the past few minutes felt like something beyond coincidence. Was it possible that this simple act of giving up his seat had led to a life-changing moment? He glanced at the note again. The corners of it were slightly curled, as if it had been folded and unfolded multiple times. He hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should open it right here in front of everyone. But something told him he had no choice. If the note was important enough for the woman to give him, it was important enough to read now. Carefully, he unfolded the paper, trying to block out the sounds of the bus, the murmurs of the passengers, and the heat of the officer's gaze burning into his back. The note was short and simple, written in a neat, almost elegant hand. It read, "You don't know me, but you're about to. This note will lead you to something greater than anything you've ever known. Trust the journey." Marcus blinked, reading the words over and over, trying to make sense of them. What did they mean? Who was this woman, and why was she so determined to get this message to him? And why did the officer suddenly seem so agitated? As the bus rolled to a stop, Marcus's thoughts were interrupted by the officer's sharp voice once more. "Hey, kid, what's in your hand?" The officer's eyes were narrowing, his tone demanding an answer. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea what the officer wanted, but the note now felt like a lifeline he wasn't sure he could throw back. Could he even keep it? Or was it going to lead him into something far worse than he could handle? The officer's footstep echoed as he moved closer, his hand resting on his belt. Marcus looked up, the note still in his hand. Everything seemed to be leading to this moment. But what was going to happen next? The officer's question hung in the air like a challenge, sharp and heavy. Marcus could feel the weight of it pressing on his chest, his mind racing for an answer, but nothing seemed to make sense. The note, with its cryptic message, felt like a secret he was now forced to protect. He wasn't sure who needed to hear it more, the officer who was clearly looking for an excuse to escalate things, or the woman who had entrusted him with something that seemed far too important to ignore. The officer's hand was still resting on his belt, his eyes fixed on Marcus, waiting for him to respond. For a moment, everything else faded away, the low hum of the bus, the passengers who had been silently watching the scene unfold. It was just Marcus and the officer, locked in this uneasy standoff, both of them struggling to maintain control of a situation that was slipping further and further from their grasp. Marcus could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him. He knew they were all waiting for him to do something, anything. Some of them probably hoped he'd stay quiet and let things calm down. Others, no doubt, were rooting for him to stand up for himself, to fight back against the unfairness of it all. He wasn't sure what the right move was, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let this moment pass without understanding what was really going on. Taking a deep breath, he folded the note carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket, not because he wanted to hide it, but because it felt like a lifeline that needed to be protected. It was something he couldn't explain yet, something that had the potential to change everything. But right now, the officer was the immediate threat, and Marcus wasn't about to let his curiosity about the note get him into more trouble. The officer took a step closer, his expression darkening. "Don't think you can just ignore me, kid. What's in your hand? What are you hiding?" His voice was a little louder now, demanding, almost mocking. It wasn't just the note he was after. He was trying to regain control, to assert his authority over Marcus in front of the other passengers. Marcus could feel his pulse quicken, but he refused to show fear. He wasn't going to let the officer provoke him into a reaction he would regret. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and met the officer's gaze, his voice steady but firm. "It's just a note. It's nothing." The officer's eyes narrowed, disbelief flickering across his face. "A note? Is that what you're going with?" His hand hovered near his radio, as though he were ready to escalate things in an instant. "I don't care what's in it, but I'm not going to let you sit there acting like nothing's going on." Marcus swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the officer's words like a hammer to his chest. He had been stopped before, questioned, interrogated, judged, and each time, he had felt smaller, more insignificant. But now, with the note burning a hole in his pocket, he knew he couldn't let this moment pass the way it always had in the past. The officer was looking for a reason to arrest him, to make him a statistic, to add another layer to the system that had been stacked against people like Marcus his entire life. And that's when he noticed it. The look in the officer's eyes wasn't just anger or frustration. There was something else there. Something more personal. As if this wasn't just about Marcus at all. The officer's gaze flickered briefly, almost imperceptibly, toward the pregnant woman, who was sitting quietly in her seat, her gaze downcast. That brief glance sent a chill through Marcus. The officer had a history with her. That much was clear. The tension in the bus grew thicker, the air heavy with unspoken words. A few passengers shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with the direction things were heading. One woman, sitting near the back, whispered something to her companion. The words were indistinct, but the tone was clear. She was worried, scared even. Everyone could feel that this wasn't just an ordinary bus ride anymore. Something much larger was at play. The pregnant woman, who had been silent up until now, suddenly stirred in her seat. Marcus noticed her hand move to her purse, her fingers trembling as they brushed against something inside. It was subtle, almost like a reflex, but Marcus didn't miss it. Her actions were deliberate, like she was preparing for something to happen. It was as if she knew, as if she had anticipated the very moment when everything would change. And then, without warning, the officer's voice broke through the growing tension. "I'm done with this," he said, his tone final, as he turned away from Marcus, his back stiff. "You'll have your day in court, kid. We'll see who's telling the truth then." For a moment, Marcus didn't know whether to feel relief or dread. The officer wasn't done with him, not by a long shot. He had made it clear that this wasn't over, that the note, the woman, and even Marcus himself were all part of something bigger than any of them had anticipated. But for now, the officer was backing off, choosing to escalate the situation later, when it could be more controlled. But Marcus wasn't ready to breathe easy just yet. The officer had already shown his hand, and he wasn't about to let it go unnoticed. Something wasn't right. The way the officer had looked at the woman, the way he had tried to provoke Marcus, it was all connected. As the bus doors opened at the next stop, Marcus hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether to get off or stay. The officer had moved toward the front of the bus, muttering to himself as he gripped his radio. Marcus glanced back at the woman, whose eyes were now locked on him, filled with something he couldn't quite place. There was a sense of urgency in her gaze, as though she knew that whatever happened next would define the rest of his life. She stood up slowly, her hand resting on the seat as she made her way toward him. Her movements were careful, measured. When she reached Marcus, she leaned in slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't let him intimidate you," she said, her words soft but firm. "The truth is bigger than any of this. Don't let them make you forget that." Marcus blinked, confused. "What do you mean? What's going on? Why?" But she was already stepping back, her hand brushing against his, as she moved toward the door. She turned once, offering him a brief, meaningful glance before disappearing into the crowd outside. The bus pulled away, leaving Marcus standing there, the weight of her words hanging in the air. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end of a story. It was only the beginning. And whatever was coming next, it was something he wasn't going to be able to escape. Not anymore. The streets outside the bus were slick with the remnants of rain, the glow of streetlights cutting through the mist that lingered in the air. Marcus sat back down in his seat, the note still burning in his pocket, pressing against his side like a secret that refused to stay hidden. His mind raced, the events of the past few minutes replaying over and over again. The officer's threat echoed in his mind. He had said he'd see him in court, but Marcus knew this wasn't going to end there. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the woman, the note, the officer, and whatever else was tangled in the web of their lives. The tension inside the bus had not subsided. If anything, it had intensified. The passengers, once lost in their own worlds, were now keenly aware of the drama unfolding. No one dared to speak. They were all waiting, uncertain of what would happen next. Some people glanced toward the back of the bus, where Marcus sat. Others averted their gaze, as if trying to pretend the storm was passing them by. But Marcus couldn't ignore it. The feeling that something far more dangerous was coming, something he couldn't outrun, was suffocating. He glanced toward the front of the bus, his eyes falling on the officer, who was now seated near the driver, his hands folded tightly in his lap. His posture was rigid, like a man trying to maintain control over a situation he could no longer fully manage. Marcus couldn't help but wonder what the officer was thinking. Did he know more than he let on? Was the woman really just a random passenger, or was there something deeper at play? He could feel it. There was more to this story, and the officer was just as trapped as he was, caught in a game that neither of them understood. The bus hit another bump, jolting Marcus from his thoughts, but his heart didn't slow. His gaze moved back to the door, where the woman had disappeared. Who was she really? What did she know? The note she had given him. There was something more to it than just a kind gesture. He was certain of it now. There was no way she had just handed him a random piece of paper. She had known something. Something about the officer. About the world they both occupied. A sudden shiver ran down his spine. He had to know. He had to understand what was happening, even if it meant confronting whatever lay ahead. The next stop was approaching, and Marcus could feel the unease building in his chest. The officer's presence loomed over the bus, like a shadow. Every moment that passed felt like a countdown, a ticking clock leading to something he couldn't predict. His hand moved to his pocket, fingers brushing the edge of the note. He had to read it again. He had to find something in those words, something that would make sense of this mess. He slid the note from his pocket, the paper now creased from the tension of his grip. He read the words once more, slowly, as if willing them to reveal something new. "You don't know me, but you're about to." This note will lead you to something greater than anything you've ever known. Trust the journey. Nothing changed. The words still seemed vague, elusive. What journey? Greater than what? Was it all a lie? Or was it a warning? His thoughts were interrupted as the bus came to a screeching halt at the next stop. A few passengers stood up, ready to exit, but Marcus stayed seated. His heart was hammering in his chest, the fear starting to bubble up. Something was about to happen. He could feel it. The officer was moving again, his boots heavy on the floor as he made his way toward Marcus, his eyes locked onto him. "I'm done waiting," the officer said, his voice low and menacing. He didn't wait for Marcus to respond. "Get off the bus." For a moment, time seemed to slow. The world outside the bus was blurry through the windows, but the pressure inside was unbearable. Marcus didn't move, his mind a whirlpool of thoughts. This wasn't just a random stop. This wasn't just about him sitting on a bus anymore. The officer had marked him, and now it was time to make him pay. But for what? "I said, get off the bus," the officer repeated, his voice rising.
"Now."
Marcus stood up slowly, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. The passengers' eyes were on him again, but this time there was a different energy in the air. A mix of fear, curiosity, and something darker. They could all feel it too. Something was going to break. Something was going to snap. Marcus reached for the door, his hands shaking as he moved past the officer, who stood blocking his path. But as he stepped off the bus, his foot hitting the pavement, he saw her. The pregnant woman, standing just a few feet away, her eyes wide with panic. She was looking straight at him, and in that moment, Marcus realized that everything he had been feeling, the fear, the tension, the overwhelming sense of doom, was nothing compared to the terror in her face. The officer was coming after him, but this time, he wasn't alone. Another figure appeared beside him. Someone in plain clothes, someone who didn't belong in this moment, but who now seemed to be an undeniable part of it. The figure was tall, with a confident stride, and Marcus's gut twisted. He didn't recognize him, but the man's eyes were hard, too hard, and they seemed to carry a message that Marcus wasn't ready to decode. Then the woman's voice broke through the chaos. "Run," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You have to run now." Marcus froze. The world around him blurred, the sounds of the city fading into the background. His instincts screamed at him to take her advice, to flee, to disappear into the night. But he couldn't move. Not yet. Not until he understood why she had said it. Why she had come back. Why the officer and this new figure were both here, closing in on him like a trap. He glanced at the officer, whose eyes now burned with an intensity Marcus couldn't ignore. The officer wasn't just angry anymore. He was desperate. And that fear, that desperation, spoke volumes about how far the situation had spiraled out of control. But what had gone wrong? What had happened to change the game? The silence stretched between them, thick with impending violence, until the officer took another step forward, his hand twitching near his holster. And then, in the chaos, Marcus heard the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked. The sound of the gun being cocked shattered the air like lightning. Marcus didn't know where it came from at first. His heart was pounding too loud in his ears, his thoughts jumbled and tangled. He spun toward the officer, thinking it was him, thinking this was it. But the officer's hand hadn't moved. He was frozen too, eyes darting past Marcus, toward something or someone behind him. Marcus turned slowly, his body tense, his instincts screaming. Standing a few steps away was the pregnant woman, but now, she wasn't alone. Behind her, shielded from view by the shadows of the street lamp, stood a teenager. A black teen, maybe 17 or 18, with wide, alert eyes and a steady hand. And in that hand was the gun. The teen didn't look angry. He looked scared, focused, protective, like someone who had just stepped into a moment he couldn't walk away from. The officer's face changed the second he saw the boy. His posture collapsed slightly, and for the first time since all this began, there was something raw in his expression, recognition, shock, and something like heartbreak. Ty, the officer breathed. Put that down. Now. Marcus's blood went cold. Ty? He turned back to the teen, who didn't flinch at the sound of the name. His gaze never left the officer. And then, like puzzle pieces snapping into place, Marcus saw it. The eyes. The jawline. The posture. There was no denying it now. This was the officer's son. The twist hit harder than anything before. Marcus didn't know whether to be stunned or horrified. The tension that had already gripped the street now wrapped around them all like a noose. The officer, who had humiliated him, cornered him, tried to control everything, was standing face to face with a truth he couldn't bury. His son, a black teen, was pointing a gun at him in defense of the very boy the officer had just tried to intimidate. No one spoke. The street was dead silent except for the faint sounds of cars in the distance and the buzz of a flickering streetlight overhead. The officer's hand slowly rose, not toward his own weapon, but in a gesture of surrender. "Tyler," he said again, this time softer. "Put the gun down. Please." But the teen didn't move. "You said you were going to let him walk. But you lied. You were going to pull it. I saw it." Marcus glanced at the woman, the pregnant woman, whose hand was now clutching her coat tightly around her stomach. Her face was pale, her body frozen. She didn't say anything, but her expression held everything: fear, pain, regret. And suddenly Marcus realized the full weight of what he'd walked into. This wasn't just about a bus ride anymore. It wasn't just about a note or a random act of kindness. This was a family's fracture laid bare in public, in the most dangerous way possible. The officer, who had spent his career controlling others, had lost control over the one thing that mattered most to him: his own son. And the pregnant woman, she wasn't just a stranger with a kind smile. She was part of the same story. The look she gave the officer said it all. They had a history, one that no one on that bus could have guessed. "I saw you," Ty said again, his voice shaking but steady. "You looked at him the same way you looked at me when I was 13, and you made me get on the ground. You didn't even recognize me then." His hand tightened on the grip. "You looked at him like he wasn't a person." Marcus felt like he couldn't breathe. The truth was spilling out, raw and messy and impossible to ignore. He didn't know how to fix this, how to stop it. All he knew was that the power in the moment had shifted completely, and now it wasn't the officer who held the control. It was his son. The officer's voice broke through again, cracked and low. "Tyler, I know I made mistakes. I know I hurt you, but this isn't the way. You taught me to be afraid," Ty said. "Every time I left the house. Every time I looked in the mirror. And then I see you do this to him." He nodded toward Marcus. "Like he's nothing. Like you forgot." The silence after that was unbearable. Marcus could feel the weight of generations of pain pressing down on all of them. This moment was about more than a father and a son. It was about what was broken between them. It was about what the city, the system, had done to people like Marcus and to kids like Ty. Marcus stepped forward slowly, his palms raised, not toward the officer, but toward Ty. "Hey," he said gently. "You don't have to do this, man. I know what you're feeling. I do. But it's not the only way. You don't want this on your shoulders." Ty's grip loosened just a fraction, but his eyes were still locked on his father. "He was gonna hurt you." "I know," Marcus said quietly. "But it wouldn't have fixed anything. And neither will this. We got something bigger here, something we can expose. This story, it's not over. But if something bad happens right now, we won't get to tell it. And we need to." There was a long pause. The officer's breathing was uneven now, like he was holding back everything he had never said. His eyes were glistening, the tension in his jaw barely contained. And then the woman, Ty's mother, stepped forward, just a little. Her voice was calm, but firm. "Tyler, please. Listen to him. Put it down. This isn't who you are." Ty's hand dropped slowly. The barrel of the gun lowered, and Marcus finally exhaled, though the pressure in his chest didn't ease. The moment had shifted again, but now the air felt heavier, like the truth had opened a wound, and no one was sure how to close it. The officer took a hesitant step forward, but Marcus stepped in between them. "You need to leave," he said to him.
Right now.
"Before this turns into something no one can come back from." The officer looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, there was no anger, no power, no superiority. Just a man staring at the consequences of everything he thought he could keep buried. And then he turned, slowly, quietly, and walked into the dark. But Marcus knew this wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. He still didn't know what the full story was. Why the woman had given him that note. Why Ty had followed them. What exactly the officer had done in his past that brought them all to this intersection. The mystery wasn't over. It had only deepened. The note was still in his pocket. The city was still watching. And somewhere out there, the truth was waiting to break wide open. The night settled into a strange silence after the officer disappeared into the shadows. Marcus stood still for a long moment, his breath finally slowing, but the unease remained. Ty had lowered the gun, but his hands were still trembling, and the woman, his mother, reached out and gently took it from him. No one said anything at first. It was as if they were all waiting for something else to crash down, something they couldn't quite name. Marcus looked at Ty, who now seemed like just a kid again, scared, overwhelmed, caught in a moment that would change his life forever. He glanced at the woman, still calm, still strong, but with pain in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "For stepping in. For everything." She gave a small nod, then reached into her coat and pulled out another folded piece of paper. She handed it to Marcus. "I didn't give you everything before," she said. "But now, you deserve to know." Marcus took it with shaky hands and slowly unfolded it. The paper was thinner than the first note, more fragile, but what was written on it cut deeper than anything else had so far. "If you're reading this, I'm probably already gone. I couldn't fix what I broke, but maybe you can. My name is Officer Daniel Keene. I made mistakes, one that changed everything. Years ago, I pulled over a man. His name was Jeremiah Cole. He hadn't done anything wrong, but I treated him like he had. He filed a report. I buried it. Months later, he died in custody during a separate incident. I stayed quiet. I lived with it. And it broke my family. The boy you met, Tyler, is his son. He doesn't know the whole truth. But he will." Marcus's mouth went dry. His eyes lifted slowly to the woman, his mind struggling to keep up with what he was reading. "Jeremiah was your husband?" he asked, voice cracking. She nodded, the words catching in her throat. "He was everything. And they took him from us. That officer, Keene, he kept it quiet for years. But eventually the guilt started eating at him. That's why he came back into our lives. He said he wanted to do right by Ty. Be there. Make amends. But the damage was already done." Marcus's head spun. The boy he had just seen stand up to a man he believed was his father was actually the son of a man that same officer helped destroy. It all made sense now. The anger, the fear, the deep, tangled mess that had led them all to this one street, on this one night. "But why me?" Marcus asked. "Why the note? Why the bus?" The woman stepped closer, her voice soft. "Because you were the one he hurt today. And you were the one who didn't react with violence. You stood your ground. You stayed kind. And I saw something in that, something he never could. Maybe you could be the one to bring it to light." Marcus looked down at the note again. His fingers tightened. The pieces were all here now. The cover-up. The guilt. The officer's son, unknowingly tangled in the past his father tried to bury. And a mother still grieving, still hoping for some kind of justice. And then came the twist. Before anyone could speak again, headlights lit the street suddenly. A black SUV rolled slowly to the curb, engine humming low. The windows were tinted and something about it felt wrong. Marcus stepped in front of the woman and Ty without thinking, shielding them. The SUV came to a stop and the back door opened. Out stepped a man in a dark suit. Not a cop. Not a thug. Clean-cut, with an ID badge clipped to his jacket and a look of calm authority. He held up a hand. "Marcus Reed." Marcus hesitated. "Yeah." The man pulled something from his pocket, a folded document. "My name is Robert Lang. Internal Affairs. We've been watching Officer Keene for some time. We knew he was cracking. Knew he'd try to confess eventually. We were just waiting to see how far he'd go. But this," he looked at Ty, then at the woman. "This was more than we expected." Marcus stared at him. "You knew? About the report? About Jeremiah?" Lang nodded. "We had pieces. But we needed someone to draw it out. Someone the officer would react to. We saw the bus footage. Everything. You were the final push. The spark that forced the truth into the open." Anger surged through Marcus's chest. "You used me." Lang didn't deny it. "We didn't expect it to go this far. But now, with that note in your hand, we can finally act." Ty stepped forward, voice raw. "So, what happens now?" Lang turned toward him. Now we arrest a man who should have been taken off the force years ago. And we open a full investigation into everyone who helped cover up what happened to your father." Marcus looked at the woman. Her eyes were still wary, but there was something else now. Hope. For the first time all night, hope had broken through the cracks. Lang held out his hand. "Can I have the letter?" Marcus looked at it one last time, then shook his head. "No. You can get your copy. But the story? That's mine to tell." Lang gave a tight nod. "Fair enough." The SUV pulled away a few minutes later, disappearing into the fog. The night was still quiet, but the energy had shifted. Something had changed, not just for Marcus, but for Ty, for his mother, and maybe for the city too. Ty looked up at Marcus. "Thanks. For not backing down." Marcus smiled faintly. "You did the same." They stood there for a moment, 3 lives forever linked by one painful, twisted story. A story that was no longer hidden. A story that, when finally told, would change everything. And as Marcus turned to walk away, that final twist still lingered in his mind. Not the officer's fall, not the hidden file, not even the broken family. But the note that started it all. A simple act of kindness on a bus. And how it exposed the truth the world was never supposed to see. In the days that followed, everything started to change, slowly but surely. The note Marcus held in his hand, the one Officer Keene had written before everything spiraled, became more than just a piece of paper. It became evidence, a confession, and a symbol. The media got hold of it after Marcus made a careful decision. He handed it to a trusted local journalist he knew wouldn't twist the story for clicks. Someone who had roots in the same community and had always tried to speak truth to power. The news spread fast. Headlines lit up with phrases like, "Racist cop exposed by his own past," and "Pregnant woman's note leads to justice," and "Black teens stand sparks change." The story caught fire, not just because it was dramatic, but because it was real, messy, emotional, human. People connected with it. They saw themselves in the faces on that bus, on that dark street, in the pain and the courage and the long overdue truth. Internal Affairs wasted no time. Officer Keene was brought in for questioning within a week. He tried to deny pieces of it at first, but the letter he wrote, his own words, left no space to hide. Investigations into past complaints were reopened. Files that had been closed too quickly, reports that had gone missing. All of it started bubbling to the surface. And with it came more voices. Other people who had once been silent stepped forward. Former colleagues. Victims. Even community leaders who had once trusted Keene now came out with regret. But more powerful than any file or court hearing was what happened in the streets. People began talking again, not shouting, not accusing, but really talking. Barbershops, churches, schools. Everyone was having conversations they'd been avoiding. About policing. About trust. About the line between right and wrong when the badge is involved. And most of all, about healing. Marcus was invited onto local radio shows, podcasts, even one national news segment. But he turned most of them down. He didn't want fame. He didn't want a spotlight. He just wanted people to listen to the real message. Kindness matters. Truth matters. And sometimes, something as small as giving up a seat on a bus can be the start of something so much bigger. Ty, still young but suddenly thrust into a world that demanded so much of him, began to change too. With his mom's support, he started therapy. He started speaking at schools, telling his story, not with anger, but with honesty. Kids looked up to him. Teachers asked him to come back. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel invisible. He felt seen. He felt heard. As for the woman, Ty's mother, her name was Camille. She went back to her job at the library, though people now knew her as the woman who gave the note that changed everything. Some treated her like a hero. Others asked if she'd always known the full truth. She told them gently, "I knew enough to know something was wrong, and I knew I couldn't carry it alone anymore." She was quiet about her pain, but firm in her purpose. A quiet fighter. Marcus stayed in touch with them both. Not because he felt obligated, but because something had clicked between them that night. Something honest. They weren't just survivors of the same moment. They were now part of each other's lives. They met for coffee sometimes or walked in the park just to breathe, to exist, to remind each other that even when the world feels impossible, people can still change it. Months passed. The case against Keene grew stronger. He resigned before he could be fired, and while criminal charges were still pending, the most important thing had already happened. He was no longer in a position to harm anyone else. And the department he left behind? It faced new demands from the community. Policy reviews, leadership shifts, more transparency. It wasn't a perfect ending. Nothing about it was clean or easy. There were still people who defended him. Still people who said Marcus was overreacting. That Ty was too emotional. That Camille should have stayed quiet. But those voices were quieter now, because the truth had weight. And once it landed, people couldn't pretend it wasn't there. One afternoon, months later, Marcus stood at a bus stop. Not the same one from before, but it had a similar feel. A mother with a stroller smiled at him as he stepped aside to make room. A group of teens laughed on the corner. The sun was warm, and for the first time in a while, the world didn't feel so heavy. He thought about everything that had happened. The confrontation, the pain, the twists that no one saw coming. But most of all, he thought about how it all started with a seat. A small gesture, a quiet kindness, one moment of recognizing someone else's humanity. That was what mattered most. He pulled out his phone and opened his notes app. Not to write something big or profound, just a thought. Never underestimate the power of being decent. One act of kindness might change someone's whole life. Or yours.